Out of the smog stepped a girl who didn't belong in a kill zone. She wore a simple white dress. Taehyun froze.
Are you okay?
I'm fine, don't worry.
The silence in the garage was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending execution. It had become a fragile, breathless thing. Taehyun looked down at the girl, his breath hitching in a way that felt foreign to a chest usually filled with iron. Her fingers were warm, moving with a feather-like grace over the jagged, raised skin of the scar that sliced across his cheek, a mark that usually served as a warning to anyone brave enough to look at him. "You have a lot of stories here," Seo-yeon whispered, her voice a soft melody that seemed to push back the grime of the concrete walls. She didn't flinch at the roughness of his skin or the stubble along his jaw. Her eyes remained closed, her face a mask of serene focus, as if she were reading a book only she could understand. "But they all feel cold, like you've been standing in the rain for a very long time." Taehyun's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to break through his tailored suit. Behind him, he could hear the faint, metallic click of his men shifting their feet, their confusion radiating through the gloom. They were waiting for a signal, the nod that would end the life of the rival sub-boss currently kneeling in the shadows of a nearby SUV. The Iron King was supposed to be a machine of absolute will, yet he felt himself rusting, immobilized by the simple, terrifying kindness of a child. "I'm not cold," he managed to rasp, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. Seo-yeon tilted her head, her fingers resting now on his cheekbones, framing his face. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Your skin is warm, but your heart is quiet. It sounds like a house with all the lights turned off." The observation hit him harder than any physical blow ever had. He looked at the rival boss, a man who had tried to siphon his shipments and kill his brothers, and found that the killing intent had evaporated, replaced by a stinging sense of exposure. He couldn't commit a murder with those small, pure hands still holding the weight of his soul. Gently, almost fearfully, Taehyun reached up. He didn't pull her hands away. He simply covered them with his own, his large, scarred palms dwarfing hers. The contrast was a sharp ache, the predator and the lamb, the darkness and the light. "Go," he barked, not looking at his men, but keeping his gaze fixed on the girl's peaceful face. "Sir," his second-in-command ventured, his voice laced with disbelief. "Everyone, get out," Taehyun commanded, the old authority returning to his voice, though it was now edged with an unfamiliar desperation. "The meeting is over. Let him live." As the sounds of engines starting and retreating footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, Taehyun remained still, a mountain of a man anchored by the touch of a girl who couldn't see the monster he had become. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 20 years. For the first time, he wasn't the Iron King. He was just a man, standing in the dark, being found. In the weeks that followed, the Iron King became a ghost haunting the daylight of Seoul. Taehyun no longer spent his afternoons in smoke-filled boardrooms or damp basements. Instead, he sat in the back of a nondescript sedan with tinted windows, watching a small figure in a white dress navigate a world that was far more dangerous than she realized. From a distance, he studied the rhythm of So-yeon's life, the way she counted steps from the bus stop, the gentle tilt of her head when she listened to the city's cacophony, and the vulnerable confidence of her cane striking the pavement. He became the invisible hand that smoothed the jagged edges of her reality. When a local street vendor attempted to shortchange her, distracted by her blindness, the man did not find a profit. Instead, he found two of Taehyun's silent, stone-faced lieutenants standing at his stall the next morning, returning the stolen one and leaving the vendor with a trembling understanding that some debts are paid in bone rather than currency. When a group of unruly teenagers blocked the sidewalk she used to reach the park, they did not see the girl. They only saw a black SUV pull to the curb and a scarred man in a tailored suit lower his window just an inch. One look from Taehyun's cold, predatory eyes was enough to clear the path before her cane ever touched their shoes. Taehyun found a strange, agonizing peace in this silent service. He was an architect of shadows, building a fortress of safety around her without ever stepping into the light. He learned the names of the flowers she lingered near and the exact time the bakery put out the fresh bread she seemed to favor. He was cleaning her world, purging it of the petty cruelties and systemic rot he had once helped cultivate. Yet, as he watched her laugh at a stray cat or navigate a busy intersection with terrifying trust, a hollow ache grew in his chest. He was protecting her from the world, but he was also protecting her from him. He remained the monster in the periphery, the man who could only express love through the clinical application of power. He was her invisible guardian, a king who had traded his throne for the privilege of watching a girl who would never see his face again. The sky over Seoul finally broke, spilling a cold, needle-like rain that turned the neon signs of the city into bleeding smears of light. Kang Tae-hyun watched from the dry sanctuary of his car as Seo-yeon stood under the leaking awning of a closed flower shop. Her white dress was beginning to gray at the hem, and her cane remained tucked under her arm as she tilted her head, listening to the rhythmic drum of the storm against the pavement. He shouldn't have stepped out. His suit was too expensive to ruin, and his presence was a magnet for the kind of attention he was trying to avoid. But the sight of her shivering, small and isolated in the deluge, overrode the iron logic that had governed his life for decades. The heavy thud of the car door closing was swallowed by the thunder. Tae-hyun approached her with a predator's silence, his footsteps masked by the downpour. He stopped 3 feet away, intending only to provide a broader shield against the wind, but the air shifted between them. The wind carried the sharp, masculine scent of his sandalwood cologne, mixed with the metallic, ozone tang of the storm, and the faint, lingering copper of a confrontation he had finished only an hour prior. Seo-yeon's head snapped toward him. She didn't recoil. Instead, her nose wrinkled slightly, her senses stitching together a memory from a dark parking garage weeks ago. "The man with the quiet heart," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Tae-hyun froze. He was a man who moved unseen through the highest corridors of power, yet she had identified him by the mere chemistry of his presence. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. "It's dangerous." "The rain isn't dangerous, Mr. Kong," she replied, using a name he had never given her. She reached out, her hand wandering through the cold air until her fingers brushed the soaked wool of his sleeve. "But you are shaking. Are you cold, or are you just afraid of being found again?" He looked down at her hand, so pale against his dark suit. He was the Iron King, a man whose face was a map of violence. Yet here he was, being handled like a wounded creature by a girl who couldn't see the blood on his hands. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He stood in the downpour, letting the rain ruin his clothes and his reputation, forced to realize that in her world, he wasn't a monster or a king. He was simply a man standing in the rain, waiting for someone to tell him it was okay to come inside. The heavy, clockwork precision of the Iron King's empire began to falter, the gears grinding with the grit of his new distraction. In the high-ceiling boardrooms of Seoul's skyscrapers and the neon-lit backrooms of its casinos, the whispers were no longer about Kang Tae-hyun's cruelty, but his absence. He was missing from the board, his seats at the high-stakes tables left empty while he sat in a nondescript sedan 3 blocks away from a blind girl's apartment. To men who traded in power, silence was not a virtue. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. Park Jin-soo, a man whose ambition was as sharp as the razor he used to discipline his subordinates, watched the surveillance footage with a predatory grin. The footage was grainy, captured from a distance in the driving rain, but the image was unmistakable. The most feared man in the city, the god of death, standing soaked and motionless while a petite girl in a white dress touched his arm. "He's not standing in the rain because he's cold," Jin-soo mused to his lieutenants, his voice a low, vibrating snarl of satisfaction. "He's standing there because he's finally found something he's afraid to lose." The news spread through the underworld like a contagion. The Iron King, once a mountain of impenetrable scars and expensive silk, had a weakness, that wore a simple white dress. The tactical maps of the city's syndicates were redrawn overnight, no longer focusing on Taehyun's ports or his warehouses, but on the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a graphite cane against the concrete. The legend of his invincibility had been a shield for 20 years, but that shield had just been shattered by the softest touch imaginable. Taehyun felt the shift in the air before he saw the signs. His second-in-command was too quiet. His subordinates' eyes lingered a second too long on his face, and the usual tribute from the smaller gangs arrived late, testing the waters. He knew the wolves were circling, their noses catching the scent of a humanity he had tried to keep hidden. He looked at the heavy platinum watch on his wrist. The time was running out. He had sought to keep So-yeon's world beautiful by staying in the shadows, but his shadow had grown too long, and now it was dragging the monsters of his own making toward her door. The Iron King was being forced to realize that a king's ransom wasn't paid in gold, but in the lives of those he dared to love. The dossier sat on the mahogany desk of the world's leading ophthalmic surgeon, its clinical white pages a stark contrast to the dark, blood-stained history of the man holding them. Taehyun stared at the high-resolution scans and the surgical projections, his eyes tracing the complex pathways of nerves and light that had failed Han Seo-yeon. The surgeon had spoken in hushed, reverent tones about a revolutionary procedure, a gift of light that could restore her vision within weeks. It was a miracle within Taehyun's reach, a simple matter of writing a check for an amount that wouldn't even dent his empire's weekly intake. Yet, his hand hovered over the pen, paralyzed by a terror that no rival syndicate could ever elicit. For 14 months, he had existed to her as a scent of sandalwood, a rumble of a voice, and a warmth that smoothed the jagged edges of her city. She saw a man who was lonely, a man with a quiet heart who stood in the rain to keep her dry. She was blind to the diagonal scar that marked him as a beast, blind to the cold, predatory calculation in his eyes, and blind to the mountain of sins that had built the very chair he sat in. He looked at his reflection in the polished glass of the desk. The Iron King was a creature of the dark, a monster forged in the soot of Seoul's underworld. If she gained the gift of sight, she would finally see the world he had cleaned for her, but she would also see the man who had done the cleaning. He feared the moment her eyes would open and the serene, trusting smile she wore would shatter into a mask of the same bone-deep horror he saw in everyone else. Shutterstock. Explore. Taehyun realized he was being selfish, hoarding her darkness to protect his own image in her mind. To keep her blind was to keep her safe in a lie where he was a hero. To give her sight was to risk her seeing the truth and turning away in revulsion. He thought of her fingers tracing the braille of his scars and wondering if, once she could see the jagged reality of them, she would ever dare to touch his face again. The pen trembled against the paper. He wanted her to see the beauty of a sunrise, but he was terrified that he would be the only ugly thing left in her world. The fragile peace Taehyun had built around So-yeon did not break with a roar, but with the sharp, clinical sound of shattering glass. It happened in the hour before dawn, the time when the city's heartbeat is at its faintest. Taehyun was blocks away, staring at the surgical consent forms, when the silent alarm on his phone pulsed like a dying star. By the time his sedan screeched into the narrow alleyway of her apartment complex, the air was already heavy with the smell of discharged gunpowder and ozone. Two men in tactical gear, professionals, not street thugs, were retreating toward a black van, their mission to snatch the Iron King's weakness, thwarted only by the two silent guards Taehyun had stationed in the shadows of the stairwell. The sidewalk was littered with brass casings, a violent intrusion into the quiet world of a girl who only knew the sound of wind and rain. Taehyun didn't wait for his car to stop. He surged into the building, his heart a frantic, jagged thing. He found So-yeon standing in the center of her ransacked living room, her hands hovering in the air as if trying to find the furniture that had been overturned. She wasn't crying, but her breath was coming in shallow, terrified hitches. The smell of the smoke had reached her, and for the first time, she looked small, not serene, but haunted. Seo Yun, he said, his voice a low, urgent anchor. She turned toward him, her sightless eyes wide. The air, it changed. It smells like the garage again. Like iron. Taehyun reached out, his hands trembling as he caught her shoulders. He saw the splintered wood of her door and the red laser dot of a distant sniper still searching the walls. The invisible guardian was no longer enough. The shadows had found her, and he could no longer keep her in the world of ordinary things. "We have to go," he whispered. "Now." He lifted her, her slight weight almost nothing against his chest, and carried her out of the wreckage of her life. He didn't take her to a safe house or a hotel. He took her to the only place where he held absolute dominion, his estate, a cathedral of glass, cold stone, and whispered violence. As the iron gates of the fortress hissed shut behind them, Taehyun realized the cost of her safety. He had saved her from the street, but he had brought her into the belly of the beast. In the fortress, there were no bakeries or flower shops, only the rhythmic pacing of armed men and the cold, sterile luxury of a man who lived for war. He set her down on a velvet sofa that felt like a tomb. He had protected her life, but as he looked at her pale, confused face, he knew he had officially ended her peace. The dining hall of the Kong estate was a cavern of black marble and low-hanging crystal, a room designed to intimidate even the boldest of rivals. Tonight, the long obsidian table was lined with the Iron King's most lethal lieutenants, men with knuckles calloused by bone and eyes that had long ago forgotten the warmth of a home. They sat in stiff, military silence, the air thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the unspoken tension of a war on the horizon. At the head of the table sat Taehyun, and beside him, a jarring splinter of light, Seo Yun. She sat perched on the edge of the velvet chair, her hands moving delicately over the silver cutlery, reading the placement of her glass and plate with a serene, practiced grace. She wore a clean white dress provided by the house staff, its purity making the dark suits around her look like stains on the atmosphere. "The soup smells like ginger and rain," Seo Yun said, her soft voice cutting through the heavy quiet like a bell. The man to her right, a scarred enforcer named Junho who had once survived a three-man ambush with nothing but a screwdriver, froze with his spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at Taehyun, his eyes wide with a plea for instruction, but the Iron King remained silent, his gaze fixed on the girl with a terrifying, protective intensity. Junho cleared his throat, the sound like gravel in a blender. It's carrot ginger, miss," he managed to grunt, his voice cracking under the weight of the girl's innocence. A bizarre, rhythmic stillness took over the room. These were men who lived for the roar of gunfire and the clatter of poker chips, yet they found themselves navigating the dinner with a clinical, almost frantic delicacy. They lowered their forks with exaggerated care to avoid the clink of metal against porcelain. They suppressed their coughs. They didn't speak of the port negotiations or the rival blood they had spilled that afternoon. For the first time in their lives, they were terrified of making too much noise in the presence of a girl who couldn't even see them. Seo Yun tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Everyone is so quiet. Are you all waiting for something?" "We are just enjoying the meal, Seo Yun," Taehyun replied, his voice a low, anchoring rumble. "It doesn't feel like a meal," she whispered, her fingers brushing the edge of her napkin. "It feels like a prayer, like everyone is holding their breath, so I don't break." The tension in the room snapped into a new, more profound kind of silence. The lieutenants looked down at their plates, unable to meet the sightless gaze of the child who had just unmasked the hollowness of their power. They were the most feared men in Seoul, yet sitting across from her, they felt like the fragile ones. The sanctuary of the fortress was not breached from the outside, but from the very heart of the Iron King's inner circle. Junho, the man who had stood at Taehyun's right hand for a decade, watched the security feeds from the shadows of the command center. He saw the way the most lethal men in Seoul now walked on eggshells, their edge blunted by the presence of a girl who smelled of lavender and spoke of quiet hearts. To Junho, Seo Yun was not a miracle. She was a structural weakness, a crack in the foundation of an empire built on the uncompromising geometry of fear. He remembered a time when Taehyun's decisions were dictated by the cold logic of expansion and the brutal necessity of survival. Now, those decisions were weighed against the nap schedule of a child and the safety of a girl who didn't even know she was living in a cage. The syndicate was a predator that required a monster at its head, and Junho believed that by loving the girl, Taehyun was effectively abdicating his throne. The betrayal was silent, executed with a single encrypted burst of data sent through a black market server. It contained the GPS coordinates of the estate's secondary ventilation shaft and the shift rotation of the perimeter guards, the only two variables that made the fortress vulnerable. Junho didn't hate Taehyun. He simply hated the man Taehyun was becoming. In his twisted loyalty to the Iron King of old, he felt he had to amputate the limb that had gone soft. "She is the poison," Junho whispered to the flickering monitors, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the security grid. "She makes him human, and humans don't survive this life." He knew that by leaking her location to Park Jin-soo, he was signing a death warrant, but he convinced himself it was a necessary sacrifice. If the girl was gone, the Iron King would return to the darkness, fueled by a rage that would swallow the city whole. He watched as the signal was received on the other side of the city, the digital confirmation blinking like a predator's eye. Inside her room, Seo-yun sat by the window, her hand resting on the reinforced glass, unaware that the man who had just served her tea was the same man who had sold her soul to the wolves. She tilted her head, listening to the hum of the estate's power, failing to realize that the rhythm of the house had changed. The hunters were no longer circling, they were coming inside. The transition from sanctuary to slaughter happened in the span of a single breath. The estate's power grid, once a steady hum of security, died with a sharp, electronic groan. In the sudden, artificial midnight, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of Seo-yun's cane echoed down the hall. Not as a navigation tool, but as a frantic heartbeat. She called out his name, her voice a fragile sliver of light in a house that had suddenly turned into a grave. Taehyun surged toward her wing, but he was met by a wall of flash-suppressed gunfire. The betrayal had been surgical. The secondary ventilation shaft had allowed Jin-soo's specialists to bypass the outer layers of iron and silk. By the time Taehyun tore through the last of the intruders, his hands slick with blood that wasn't his, the room was empty. The window was shattered, the lavender scent of her detergent replaced by the acrid, metallic tang of a flashbang. He found her cane on the floor, snapped in half. A low, vibrating snarl escaped his throat, a sound that was less than human. The Iron King, who had carefully curated his suits, and his silence was gone. He didn't call for a tactical briefing or a diplomatic resolution. He walked into his private armory and began to strip away the pretense of the businessman. He didn't reach for a handgun. He reached for the tools of the butcher. He didn't need to see the culprit to know the destination. He knew how the underworld thought because he had written its laws. If they had taken his light, he would make the world so dark they would beg for the sun to return. As he stepped out into the pouring rain, the blood from a superficial graze on his temple ran down into his diagonal scar, painting a crimson path over his jaw. His eyes, once calculating, were now hollow pits of absolute clinical rage. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a force of nature that had been denied its prey. "They think they took a girl," Taehyun whispered to the storm, his voice a jagged edge that felt like it could cut the very air. "They don't realize they've just opened the door to the abyss." He got behind the wheel of a black sedan, his hands gripping the leather until it groaned. He wasn't driving to a negotiation. He was driving to a funeral, one that would require 1,000 caskets. The invisible guardian was dead, and in his place stood the monster the world had spent 20 years fearing, finally given a reason to stop playing pretend. The rival syndicate's hideout was an abandoned cold storage facility, a cavernous tomb of rusted iron and freezing fog that felt like a physical manifestation of Taehyun's psyche. Inside, Park Jin-soo's men moved with the frantic energy of those who knew they had invited a demon into their house. They had the girl, they had the high ground, and they had the numbers, but as the facility's primary power grid hummed and then died, they realized they had nothing but the dark. Taehyun didn't enter with gunfire. He entered like a shadow, merging with the night. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his massive frame, his tactical boots making no sound on the frost-covered concrete. He didn't need light to find them. He followed the scent of their fear and the frantic, rhythmic clicking of their safety switches. To Taehyun, the darkness wasn't an obstacle. It was his kingdom, the only place where the Iron King could truly shed the skin of man and become the monster he was born to be. The first man died without a sound, a phantom hand reaching from the gloom to snap his neck before his rifle could even clear its holster. The second and third followed in a blur of clinical violence, their cries swallowed by the heavy, freezing air. Taehyun didn't use a gun. He used the environment, using the sharp corners of industrial crates and the jagged edges of his own clinical rage to systematically dismantle the perimeter. He wasn't just killing them. He was erasing them. "Where is she?" His voice drifted through the facility, a low, vibrating snarl that seemed to come from every shadow at once. Jin-soo's elite specialists, men who had fought in wars across 3 continents, found themselves firing blindly into the mist, their muzzle flashes illuminating nothing but the empty space where a predator had been a second before. Taehyun watched them from the rafters, his eyes hollow pits of absolute, lethal authority. He waited until they had emptied their magazines into the dark, and then he descended. By the time he reached the center of the facility, the air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the ozone of short-circuited electronics. He found Seo-yeon in a small, windowless office, her hands tied with a roughness that made his vision swim with crimson. She was huddled in the corner, her white dress a jarring beacon of purity in the slaughterhouse he had created. Seo-yeon, he breathed, the monster receding just enough for the man to speak. She didn't scream. She tilted her head, her sightless eyes finding the direction of his voice through the carnage. "The air," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "It's too hot. You brought the fire with you, didn't you?" Taehyun looked at his hands, slick with the life of his enemies, and for the first time, he felt the true weight of the abyss. He had won the darkness, but as he reached for her, he feared the heat of his rage would finally burn the only light he had left. The iron gates of the cold storage facility hissed shut behind them, leaving the carnage and the metallic tang of gunpowder to be swallowed by the Chicago night. The drive back to the city was silent, the only sound the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers clearing the relentless rain. Taehyun steered the car toward the one place where their world had first collided, the underground parking garage where a touch had undone 20 years of iron-fisted rule. When the car hummed to a stop in the familiar fluorescent gloom, the environment felt different. The concrete pillars and numbered spaces no longer felt like a fortress or a kill zone. They felt like a confession. Taehyun stepped out and opened the passenger door, his movements devoid of their usual predatory sharp edges. He helped Seo-yeon stand, her hand resting in his with a trust that felt like a weight far heavier than his concealed sidearm. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice a soft ripple in the stagnant air of the garage. Taehyun didn't answer immediately. He looked at his reflection in the luxury SUV's window. The tailored black suit was ruined. His face was smeared with the soot of the abyss, and the diagonal scar on his cheek seemed more pronounced than ever. He was the Iron King, a man who had burned an empire to the ground tonight. But as he looked at Seo-yeon, he realized the crown was nothing but a collar. "I'm leaving the board," he said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "There will be no more kings." No more iron anything. He turned to her and knelt, a gesture that would have been unthinkable to the man he was 14 months ago. He took her hands and placed them back on his face, right where they had been the night she first saw him. Look at me again, Seo-yun, he whispered. Tell me what you see now. Her fingers moved with intentional, delicate precision. She traced the jagged line of his scar, then moved her thumbs to the corners of his eyes. A small, serene smile touched her lips, one that mirrored the halo of the car's headlights behind them. The heart is no longer quiet, she murmured. It sounds like someone who has finally come home. Tae-hyun closed his eyes, leaning into the warmth of her palms. He didn't need the gift of light to see his future. He didn't need a throne to feel powerful. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the golden boss card of the Dragon Syndicate, the symbol of his absolute authority, and dropped it onto the oil-stained concrete. The Iron King is dead, he said, his voice no longer a rumble of war, but a promise of peace. From now on, I am only your eyes, and I will make sure the world stays as beautiful as you believe it is. He stood up and took her hand, leading her out of the shadows toward the ramp that led back to the world of flower shops and bakeries. The base shadow and the Iron King were gone. In their place were a girl in white and a man who had finally chosen the light.